Hi, I'm Gareth Kane. Welcome to the Net Zero Business Podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Vicky Lofthouse, who's the principal of Enable Sustainability, to talk about one of my favorite topics, design and innovation. So, welcome to the podcast, Vicky.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. It's nice to be here.
As usual, we start with how did you get started in sustainability?
So, I've got a background in industrial design, and when I was doing my degree, I was introduced to the topic of green design, which I thought was like really fascinating. I really liked the fact that there was this other element to design as I was kind of going through my studies. When I finished my degree, my major project was in that sort of area, and then I moved into working as a consultant. Didn't really, I was finding I was kind of being asked to design sort of things that were a bit weird and it wasn't really resonating with me. And then I got the opportunity to do a PhD at Cranfield University, which was with Electrolux. So they were looking to design the world's first, like the world's most eco vacuum cleaner. No, cooker, sorry, the most eco cooker, where that came from. So they were looking for PhD students to support that, and they had a studentship. So I got involved with that, which was something I very much fell into. But so that really kind of got me kind of going in that area.
So,
And
how does an eco-friendly cooker vary from a standard cooker of the past?
So, I mean, this was back in like 1998. So at the time, there was very little work being done in terms of sustainability. They were forward thinking enough to recognize that there were opportunities for improving the environmental impact that their products were having. So at the time, there was the big players in the area with people like Sony and Philips, and Electrolux were part of that kind of cohort of companies that were starting to recognize actually there was an impact that they were having and they could do something about it. So we would be looking at things like educating design teams, looking at bringing maybe alternatives to chrome, looking at heat loss, and also even kind of bringing in bits of consumer behaviour. So like whether you open the door to look in there to let all the heat out while you're looking to see if your cake's risen, and all that sort of stuff. So it was kind of, they were doing quite a few of these things as well. So it was kind of a combination of recognizing that what they were doing was actually improving the environmental performance, but also um, looking beyond that and looking for other opportunities.
But did some of these ideas become mainstream? Does the average cooker now have some of those
Yeah, definitely.
features?
So that yeah, they were very much. It was very much kind of about. They were really interested to improve their performance. So at the time, energy efficiency was I mean, it obviously still is, but like the energy labels were quite new. They've obviously over the years they've just got kind of harsher and harsher and harsher. So actually, yes, those improvements will have been kind of integrated as it's kind of carried on. But that was kind of the starting point, and they wanted to sponsor research to look. I looked at quite a lot of kind of integrating eco design thinking within the product development process. So how you actually embedded that within product development and how it became part of what designers and engineers thought about in that process, because there really wasn't anything around at the time. It was all very new. I mean, there's lots of tools and methods and all sorts around these days, but there was nothing at the time. So it was kind of cutting edge stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
then how did your career develop post
So
cookers?
yeah, so then I left. I finished my PhD, and there really wasn't very much. Kind of, it was a very new area, and certainly in the UK, there was a few opportunities in sort of Sweden and the Netherlands, but not very much. So I ended up going into academia and doing lots of research with companies all around sustainability, teaching, and then doing little bits of consultancy work that came along. But there wasn't a huge appetite for this sort of like product related innovation when it came to sustainability. It was there wasn't so much call. It was a very different kind of world to what we live in now in terms of like what people were looking for. So stayed in academia for 20 odd years, and then about 4 years ago decided it was time to be doing what I really should be doing, and set up my own business and started doing this on a much more full-time basis, moving to full-time recently.
Yeah. So what is this doing this?
What is
Yes.
this? What am I doing? Why am I doing it? It's a really good question. So what I do is I work with product-based companies, often product manufacturers, and I help them to integrate sustainable innovation into the product development process.
Mhm.
So that can be it's across the full life cycle. So it might be it could be at any stage of the life cycle. So it could be to do with materials, it could be to do with the way that the product's used, it could be to do with end of life or bringing products back at the end of life, extending life, all of that stuff that kind of comes under the remit of sustainable innovation. I help companies to explore and embed as appropriate in their business.
Yeah. And I suppose when we're talking about this, what is your general pitch? What are the benefits of design, sustainable design to
Yeah.
industry? So,
So I think there's two real key areas, and I'm always going on the value front. So I'm very much about using sustainable innovation to create value. So um, I appreciate there's kind of a lot of within the sustainability world, there's a lot of focus on data and carbon and all of those things are important. But I think actually, if you want to try and drive change, then actually innovation is really important in creating things that are just better products that are better made, that are going to have less impact and a better user experience. Is got to be a good thing. So for me, it's about value, creating value, whether that's through the final consumer experience or whether that's through like the value through creating, like not spending so much money on things that you don't need to, and also reducing costs and risk. So they're kind of the three areas I would focus on.
yeah. Do you ever find a tension? Because, I'm thinking back to when you used to get little catalogs of so-called eco products. Most of them were terrible. I bought a supposed log maker that should turn newspapers into something that you put in your fire
Yeah,
as fuel, and it never worked. And I have beside me a broken wind-up radio, which was
I have one of those.
said in the day to be wonderful. And a lot of people sort of assumed that if you bought an eco product, in inverted commas, that you would be paying through the nose for something that didn't work. So
Yeah,
when you're saying that your whole pitch is increasing value, do you
yeah.
ever feel there's a countervailing force of sort of people's experience of maybe early eco design products?
That's really interesting. I think there used to be. I think actually the sort of the damage that was done by the recycled toilet paper era was pretty phenomenal. But I think what's happened is that there's less talk to the public about the eco nature of things that we're creating, and it's more conversations that are happening B2B, happening behind the scenes, happening with the supply chains. So um, rightly or wrongly, and it's certainly been exacerbated in recent the last year or so, that I see at the moment there's very little in the way of communication to end consumers about how much better things are for the environment, just because of kind of the political climate that we're in. Prior to that, there were, I think, yeah, I think initially there was a lot of damage, but actually the conversations are more on a business to business level now, rather than and companies recognizing that actually if you can make things last longer and you can improve your customer like relationships and keep them in your pipeline for longer, and they are part of your supply chain as well, then actually there is value to be created there.
Yeah. And I suppose the sort of eco section of the supermarket has disappeared to a certain
Mm,
amount, isn't it? But it does it feels sometimes like there's a badge on everything, a
yeah,
label on everything,
yeah,
which makes
that's
me
true.
wonder whether, and you were talking about the energy labels before, how meaningful those standards are, or whether, if that becomes normal practice to be, I don't know, you talked about toilet paper, to have a sustainable sourcing label
Mm.
on toilet paper. How do we drive on beyond that?
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting kind of changes coming in with the greenwashing standards that have been kind of launched earlier this year. I think prior to that there was some pretty ropey claims being made, and actually there's a lot of sense in kind of containing that, making that more kind of reliable. And I think there was a real need for that. I do think in terms of the sort of backlash to that is actually companies who are doing quite good work feel less comfortable about sharing what they're doing. And again, that sort of also ties into that kind of like the climate of not wanting to talk about sustainability very much. So In terms of labeling, there's yeah, I mean, I think it's been proliferating since the 90s, hasn't it? It's just kind of crazy town in that sort of place. I think some interesting initiatives for labeling in different sectors, but I'm not completely sure that consumers anyway are. I don't think we're in a place where consumers really get it
Yeah.
enough to for that to have meaning and have real value.
Yeah, I think one of the more interesting things I have heard, and this is going back a few years, but somebody from Marks and Spencer's told me that they wanted to be the gatekeeper on sustainability. They didn't want the consumer to have to choose between two products and
Yes,
decide, right, shall I go for the greener one or the standard one? That they wanted to integrate sustainability
yeah.
into all their products.
I think that's really interesting. Actually, I was going to mention a minute ago B Corp because I think that's another really good example of a gatekeeper. So if you're vaguely into this sort of thing and you see something as a B Corp company, then you've kind of that's a shortcut to knowing that pretty much it's probably fine.
Yeah,
And having those sort of like shortcuts can be quite valuable for people who are driven to be looking for specifically for things that are better. But I'd hope we'd get to a place where actually like we can improve the majority of things so that we're not proliferating like rubbish product design, but actually getting good products on the market
yeah.
that last longer and do better.
But every time I get, I'm with you. I'm quite idealistic and hope all these things will happen. And then we get disposable vapes,
I
which
know.
are one of the most terrible products ever to hit the market. Not least because they set bin lorries on fire.
Yeah, you won't get no argument from me there. I think they're absolutely
Yeah,
horrendous.
and I do sometimes muse on whether in a less optimistic phase, whether we're pushing against sort of economics that don't add value or add minimum value.
I think when you can start, there are obviously a lot of challenges to the circular economy and to actually embedding circularity into product design. But I think when you can start benefiting from that, that's when it becomes value added to companies. So if you're looking at moving more into leasing models where you retain the value and you actually retain the incentive to kind of create things that last longer, that can be rolled out, can be upgraded, can be modular, then it starts to make an awful lot more sense from a cost perspective. And I think there are companies. I see companies around. I've got clients I work with who are very much exploring and interested in pursuing that, but they're recognizing it's a tricky challenge to actually embed it within your industry, and that it's not always that straightforward, and it takes time and work.
Yeah. So, well, that takes me on neatly to the next question I was going to ask you, which is, what are the challenges? What do you find are the barriers to, going from business as usual to a sort of a breakthrough innovative sustainability product?
I think often one of the key barriers are individuals. So I often find within the teams I work with, I've come in because somebody recognizes that it's important. Maybe a little group of people think it's really important, and they've obviously got some budget and got me involved, and that's all great. But actually, you've got to take everyone with you. So there's a real need to kind of upskill teams so that I too often see sustainability managers trying to go it alone, and actually that's really lonely, it's really hard, and it's really soul destroying. So actually raising awareness across the company as to why it's important, what's in it for them, like the so what, all that sort of stuff,
Yeah.
is really important, because otherwise you're actually battling your own colleagues before you even worry about the supply chain. So I would say that's kind of like the first port of call to kind of overcome, is actually to make sure your team is on board, so
Yeah.
that even if they might not be like massively into it, they do, even if they get it from a risk, sort of a de-risking perspective, because that is another reason that clients come to me. They recognize that it's a potential risk for their industry, and they want to do something about it before it becomes an actual risk.
Yeah. We mentioned before the sort of product service system or leasing
Mm,
model of moving from a product to service. And, the one I use most is I'm a member of a Co-Wheels, which is a Newcastle-based car club. They've got a national presence. And I was disappointed to see Zipcar is withdrawing from the UK
Oh,
who run the same model, and I hope it's not a a sign of things to come, because
mm,
it is a great model to get more out of less,
yes. Yeah.
because the same car probably, Co-Wheels claim that one of their cars takes 13 cars off the road,
Mm,
which is quite extraordinary. But I don't know what stage of maturity that's at, whether it's still people like me are in a niche, or whether
yes.
it's becoming mainstream.
So I think it works much more easily in a B2B into B2B provision,
Yeah.
because there's just so much more control over it. So I'm certainly seeing the conversations I'm seeing are generally in that B2B area, and because they can see they've already got their suppliers and their supply chains, they've got good relationships with various people, and they can kind of everyone they can start to kind of negotiate and look for opportunities for everybody in the kind of like the network.
Mhm.
Whereas when you start getting like individuals involved, it becomes more like it's more of an open system, so it's much more tricky to manage. And I think cars are a really interesting example. There's quite a few sort of food related examples that like refills and take backs and all these sort of things, which I think are kind of moderately successful, depending on the kind of the environment in which it's run. So I often talk about the context in which something is designed for being really key. So if you're using that sort of system in a really kind of closed environment, maybe like a university
Mm.
campus, or a kind of like a business type campus where you've got a series of businesses in a kind of closed environment, then sorts of things can work really well. But as soon as people are out in the wilderness, wandering around town, doing their own thing, it all starts to become a lot less kind of like great from a kind of financial point of view and a business model point of view.
Yeah. Well, I suppose Xerox were famously one of the pioneers of the product service system, and that was
Mm.
largely a business point of view. Nobody really wants to own a photocopier.
No, no.
They want the
No one re
photocopies.
I think within business, the business sector kind of there's not a huge amount of value in owning a lot of things. And when you're thinking of like if you're supplying to so when you've got that kind of social housing environment, then actually
Yeah.
there's opportunities there for leasing if you're kind of working with the management systems rather than actually just kind of selling to individuals or leasing to individuals, which I think becomes quite a different kind of financial commitment and situation when you're kind of having to like deal with like lots and lots of monthly outgoings. It doesn't work
Yeah.
so well.
Well, it's something I've always wondered is, when I'm of a similar vintage to yourself. So when we were students, whatnot, you used to move house, then you had to sort of pack up boxes and boxes of books and photographs and music and DVDs and etc. And a lot of that's just streamed now, or
Yeah.
keep your photographs online. And I would love as an experiment to sort of work out. I suppose we used to call it ecological rucksack, wasn't it? The amount
Oh
of
yeah, yeah.
material you carry around. I would love to see how that varies, whether it has reduced from a student today to a student back in
Oh,
our
that's very
era,
interesting.
or whether they've just filled that space with other stuff.
Yes. I would imagine it's probably the latter, but yeah, that's it's really interesting, isn't it? And I think we also we have very little understanding, like generally speaking, as to like digital footprint. It's certainly it's something that's kind of I'm obviously aware of, but even I don't feel I got a particular handle on my digital footprint, and I know what I'm doing. So I think it's certainly coming up. And there's a few people I've worked with recently who are working in that space, and they're looking to like decarbonize websites and apps and all that sort of stuff, which is interesting. But it's also very hidden, and I think it's already quite hidden from consumers as to what is good practice and what to avoid. So it's just kind of another thing that's kind of going on in the background. And I think, in some respects, there's quite a lot to be said for making things more visible so that there's a conversation about it so people actually get it and they understand it, rather than like if we take too much away from people, and it's all automatically done for them, then they don't even know they're doing it. So it's good in the fact that it's getting done, but it's not so good in the fact that they're not being educated
Yeah.
and having power to make decisions.
Yeah. Well, that whole thing of the 50 quid man, the cliche going out on a Friday lunchtime from work and going into HMV or somewhere and buying a DVD or two or three to watch at the weekend. That's all gone, in terms of, and nobody really regrets it. I used to be very proud of my record collection, and I've still got it, but it doesn't really have that same
Yeah.
sort of emotional connection. Now I can get any music I want just by tapping on my iPad. So I I'm just always musing about public acceptance, because sometimes certain things seem to get accepted very readily, and other times people aren't interested at all.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And there's a lot to be said by doing a lot of this stuff by stealth, because if people don't care and it doesn't actually make an awful lot of difference to their experience, then like as we shouldn't not do it just because if they because there's not promo in it, and it's just the right thing to do, and it also adds it adds to your kind of like CSR as a business. Then just get on with it quietly, which I see a lot of actually at the moment. A lot of people just kind of quietly getting on with it, and then like when the Trump era is over and kind of we've moved on from where we are at the moment, then they'll have all their ducks in a row for talking about it more openly and kind of bringing people along. But I'd say I do see a lot of conversations within the supply chain rather than with customers. In fact, that piece of work I did recently was it was all about remanufacture, and it was really, really difficult to find anything like in print on the web about current practices in remanufacture, because people just were not talking about it publicly, even
Yeah,
if they were doing it.
yeah. There was an advert recently. I'm trying to think of what it was trying to pitch remanufactured electronics at people. It must have been on a podcast or a YouTube
Okay.
video or something.
Yeah.
So there are people trying it anyway, and spending money
Yeah.
trying to advertise it. So
I think people are doing it. Well,
yeah,
I know people are doing it. But it was quite a deep dive to actually kind of extract what was actually going on, because it's definitely hidden behind a very kind of like opaque wall at the moment. But we'll see. I think there's money to be made, and as resources become more expensive, materials and electronics become more expensive, then actually the sensible thing is to keep what you own and feed it back into your feedstocks, rather than keep having to buy virgin material and new
yeah,
components.
yeah. I can imagine that with rare earth metals, as
Mm,
people are going to start realizing that there is a lot of value in
yeah,
in
yeah,
our junk drawer,
yes,
but realizing it might be another issue.
yeah.
You mentioned circularity, which is an interest of mine as well. But the issue, I suppose, when you're trying to create a circular economy, is you have to create a new economy. We've got this linear, dominant, reasonably dominant in most sectors. Take, make,
Mm,
waste, and I mentioned disposable vapes; they would be the epitome of that.
yeah.
But you know, going to a circular economy where resources are endlessly cycled, is the supply of those materials one of the big uh, challenges, one of the big barriers to adopting those models?
I think there's lots of things here. So I think there's first of all there's some really interesting kind of initiatives being set up at the moment where I'm aware of two kind of like different scale um, initiatives that are going on where people are actually kind of organizing collecting waste and brokering it to supply it to other companies, so that they're actively looking to broker those relationships, both on kind of like a quite a local level, but also on a kind of like industrial level, so that kind of more industrial symbiosis
Yeah,
versus kind of like a smaller kind of collecting of like offcuts from like the leather industry and feeding them into other sectors, maybe university students, that sort of thing. So there's quite a lot going on there. But I think in terms of like making it happen, I see it more of like as a piecemeal meal thing, and it will for me. I think the best opportunities come where it doesn't suit all sectors, and I think it's sensible for where companies can see opportunity, then they can see value, and then they can see the benefit of investing. And I see it being driven that way. I can't see any sort of. I might turn around in 10 years' time and go, well, what did I know? But I can't see anything that's kind of like going to like motivate a mass change in the way that we operate, because I haven't ever experienced that sort of kind of mass change before. But I do see change happening where there's recognition that there's opportunity to save money and make money, and to actually just operate more sensibly and more just in a cleverer way, a smarter way. So that's kind of how I sort of see it coming in. But
Yeah, you get brownie points for mentioning industrial symbiosis, by the way.
thank you very much.
For anybody who doesn't know, that's one company's waste becoming another's raw material. And the reason why I love IS so much is that I set up and ran a industrial symbiosis project on Teesside over 20 years ago that later became part of the National Industrial Symbiosis Project. But funnily enough, one of the little triggers to getting that running is we banned the word waste. So
Interesting resource.
it was a publicly funded thing, so we weren't charging anybody for it, but we ran these public
Mm,
workshops, and we found that it was a joke at first. I said we're not going to use the W word, and
mm,
everybody laughed, and it became a running joke. But I noticed that workshop was far more successful than the two
that's
we'd
really
run
interesting.
before.
Yeah,
And again, when we're talking about the sort of individuals and mental, um, trying to get people over that hump of not doing what you do every day, not
mm,
following business as usual, and get out of your comfort zone and think about things differently. That was a very strangely but satisfying little win. Was literally banning the word waste. Then suddenly people did start seeing the materials
yeah.
as resources.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think having those sort of brokerage is really helpful, because people don't necessarily have the time or the inclination to like try and find opportunities. And if you've got people with that kind of overview, then actually those opportunities are much more forthcoming. And I think it's quite exciting. Actually, I had a conversation just before this where we were talking about exactly that, looking for kind of bringing in kind of utilizing a network to find raw materials that could be reused again.
Yeah, it's a surprisingly satisfactory when you satisfying when you get a win, and suddenly somebody starts diverting huge amounts of stuff that was
Yeah.
going literally
And
to
actually,
landfill or for
everyone
energy.
seems to, it seems to go down, goes down well on both accounts as well, because obviously the provider is no doubtly saving landfill costs, and the receiver is getting like great resource that they kind of the stories are there,
Yeah.
and it's good.
So on that sort of psychology of change, psychology of innovation, do you have any sort of killer tactics that you use when you're working with businesses to get them to stop thinking about business as usual and sort of push the boat out a bit and think more widely, the cliche being outside the box?
So I think normally when they've come to me, they probably already realize they need to think differently. The thing that I do often find is that companies come to me thinking that they have a particular solution they want to pursue, and it's quite quickly like apparent that actually it's not the right solution. So in that sort of scenario, that's really, really common. It's happened multiple times. And I would say, like, I start by saying I can commend the fact they want to make change. That's great. But actually, kind of collecting some data to help drive your decision making is more sensible. So we'd use something like an abridged carbon footprint
Mm.
tool. So we've got like a really kind of quick and easy modeling tool we just use in Excel to help to model their particular context, so their particular product, where it's going, what's it's coming, where it lives, what it does, and how long it lasts for, and all that sort of stuff, so they can have a really good look at what they should be focusing on. And then so that would be my key thing, is trying to get companies to focus on helping them to identify the key hotspots they should be focusing on, but also at the same time you can actually then identify opportunities as well. So there might be certain things they need to address, and certain things that if they focus on would bring them extra value. So then that sort of knowledge is then used to drive momentum and change.
So do you have any pet projects, any case studies that you can share? Obviously, some of them you may not want to share, but do you have any pet projects that you could share with us?
Um, Most of the work I do is confidential, so it's a bit tricky. We did do a sort of a bit of an aside. So we did do a piece of work for a waste clearance company, which was using that modeler actually that I just mentioned, but to help them actually to quantify the amount of resource that they were diverting from landfill. So they were already kind of in working in that sort of eco stream, and they wanted to kind of quantify it, and they were an SME who were kind of just wanted that kind of extra data to drive drive the business forward. So that was quite interesting. We've done something similar on a packaging project that I can talk about that was a really interesting win that we did recently. That was with Triton Showers. So they were looking to move away from their printed packs, which had like plastic windows, and they wanted to get rid of the plastic. They didn't want it. They wanted to kind of move to a more eco packaging that was supported the brand, and they're doing a lot of work in their with their products in terms of water saving and energy saving. So they wanted to make sure the packaging kind of sat alongside that well. And as not only did they kind of reduce the carbon of the pack by we did some analysis, worked out what was important. So they reduced their carbon, but they also reduced their plastic spend and their cardboard spend as well. So like the whole thing was like a massive win. And
Yeah.
then because those boxes were no longer printed, then they didn't need to be protected when they were being delivered, so they could just be flat packed and put into these kind of reusable dolafs. So they didn't that kind of then remove the need for their tertiary packaging as well. So there was kind of like this knock-on effect of all these kind of
Yeah.
good things that happen by one little change had this cascade into all these different opportunities, different kind of like so environmental opportunities, but also cost saving, right? Kind of spin-offs that they didn't expect.
Yeah. That's interesting. I like the cascades of benefits. If
Mm,
even in industrial systems, if you lightweight one thing, then you can
yeah.
just start taking resource away from
Mm.
all sorts of other bits and pieces.
Yeah,
It's so
yeah. The
fascinating.
knock-on effect and it's great to see. And I think once companies sort of experience that, I mean, Triton are already doing a lot of work, but actually, um, those little wins that you see in something as small as packaging, that then can kind of like for the people in the business who are maybe not quite so sold, it then kind of has that knock-on effect of like, oh, actually, this is really good. We can actually we we can make change, we can do things, and that that can be really beneficial.
Yeah. And then, of course, sometimes the non eco benefits, you're talking about the cost
Yeah,
of goods and all the
absolutely.
other packaging, you know, throughout the system as well, is often an easier sell than, and you're going to be able
Oh
to
yeah,
recycle everything.
and I think absolutely. I mean, sell all the benefits. It's certainly yes, it's good. It's really good. Of course, it's really good to have an environmental benefit, but that definitely why you sell it across the whole kind of platform. I think.
Yeah, yeah, always good stuff. Right, well, we've been chatting for quite a while. I was just wondering, sort of what if you had any core lessons you've learned or principles that you stick to that you'd want to share with everybody listening about why they
Yeah,
should.
yeah. So I think it's probably key thing that I always talk about is that context is key. So I think what's a good solution for one company for one set of companies is not necessarily a good solution for others. So actually understanding your context, what you're selling, where you're selling it to, who your consumer is, what the kind of environment it's being sold into is really important. And actually understanding that will help to focus your attentions on where you should be looking and what's going to have the biggest impact in your business, both from a financial point of view and from a value point of view and an environmental point of view. So yeah, context is absolutely key. I think that there's huge value in case studies, in generating, sharing, and kind of disseminating case studies broadly and case studies of not just best practice but better practice. I think there are people are a bit nervous about better practice these days. I don't think they should be. I think I've always advocated transparency. I think if you're transparent about what you're doing and you recognise it's not perfect, but you have that kind of, you have the confidence to have that conversation and talk about what you're doing and how you know you're on a journey and that this is how you're improving. I think that's hugely valuable. I think it's valuable for the industry as a whole. It helps um, it helps others to see that it's possible and demystifies that kind of all the kind of pressure around trying to improve. And I think that's sort of, yeah, really, really important. But I think also recognizing, and it's another bit of a bugbear of mine. I find it really frustrating when people go, "Oh, oh, it's not that difficult." It's like it is actually quite challenging, and I think recognizing it's challenging and giving people the kind of credit for
Yeah.
actually it is quite challenging, but it doesn't mean it's not possible, and lots of people are doing it. I think it's important to recognize that. Otherwise, that can be quite off-putting as well. If you kind of feel like, oh, it's not, we're a bit foolish because we can't do this. It's not that easy, but it is. Doesn't mean it's not worth it, and it doesn't mean it's not going to be like really valuable for your business if you do put the effort in and kind of work for it. So,
Yeah, definitely. I've come across quite a few cases where, one person's innovation has become almost a company legend.
mm,
Well, one of my clients, one of the production engineers, was in his son's car, which had automatic engine cutout, and he thought,
okay,
well, why can't we do this in our production line?
yeah,
Because the thing had been set up that if you switched off, you had to recalibrate, you had to go through a lengthy setup phase, and he worked out a way of bringing the same principle in, and it saved huge amounts of energy, and everybody in the business knew about it.
yeah, it's
So
interesting.
it sort of crosses over that thing about case studies as well, showing
Yeah,
people that these things can be done and there
yeah.
are better ways of doing it and it can be successful. I think is really important rather than sort of just talking in concepts all the time.
Yeah, there was a really interesting case study that I used in a recent bit of training actually, and it was about an extra X-ray machine, and they'd saved like tons and tons of energy and all this sort of stuff. And when you kind of broke it down, it was like they basically worked out that if you turned it off, it saved lots of energy. So they created a way that it would turn back on really quickly, like PCs do now, but
Yeah.
they didn't used to. So all that was all that was needed because if they knew they could turn it on quickly, they would turn it off. And it was so that's the kind of so little tiny little innovations like that can save like huge amounts of energy.
Yeah. There's an element of going back to the psychology that we were talking about before of change and everything. There's an element of that is cutting the mental barrier to doing something like switching
Absolutely.
things off.
Yeah,
You know.
absolutely.
So
Because if you think back to like, the 80s when you turned a computer off, it took like half an hour to turn back on, whereas now it you just they all just open and they're on and
yeah.
it's just so much quicker. So you do. So yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for Vicky. Sorry, thank you very much for that, Vicky. Get the words out straight. That was very interesting. As I've said at the start, eco design is one of my favorite topics, and it was great to chew over your
Yeah.
experience, isn't it?
Yeah, it's been great. It's been a really interesting conversation and lots of interesting mulling. I enjoyed it. Thank you.